The first time Claire touched me like that, I froze so completely that I forgot how to breathe, and it took me 3 full seconds to realize the thing spreading through my chest wasn't panic at all. It was the terrifying electric feeling of finally being touched by someone who meant it. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday in February, the kind of night where the radiator in our apartment groaned, like it was dying, and the windows wept condensation down onto the sill. I was on the couch grading essays, a blanket over my knees, half watching some nature documentary with the sound down low, when she walked in from her shift at the diner. Cheeks red from the wind, nose pink, hands trembling. She didn't say hello. She didn't even take off her coat. She just walked straight over, sat down beside me, and said, in a voice so small it barely registered as a sentence, "My hands are freezing." And before I could offer her the blanket, before I could suggest tea, before I could do any of the safe, sensible things a roommate does for another roommate, she reached over and slid both of her ice-cold hands underneath the hem of my sweatshirt, pressing her palms flat against my stomach, and just stayed there, like she needed to steal my warmth to prove to herself she was still alive. If you believe that small moments like this one can crack a person wide open, that sometimes the quietest gestures carry the loudest meaning, then I want you to hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me you're watching. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that connection can save us. And subscribe to Kindness Corner if you haven't already. This channel exists because I believe ordinary people doing small, extraordinary things for each other are the closest thing to magic this world has left. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand who Claire and I were before that night, so you can understand why her cold hands on my skin nearly broke me in half. My name is Daniel, and 8 months before that February night, I was a man who had quietly given up on the idea that anyone would ever choose me again. I don't mean that in a dramatic, self-pitying way. I mean it the way you accept that a bone, once broken badly enough, will always ache before it rains. My fiancée, Elena, had left 2 years earlier, 3 weeks before our wedding, with a text message that said she needed to find herself, and a note on the kitchen counter that thanked me for everything, as if 2 years of my life could be folded into a single word of gratitude and left behind like a tip on a table. I had spent those 2 years rebuilding myself into someone smaller and safer, someone who taught high school English, graded essays on Friday nights, watched documentaries alone, and told himself that solitude was simply a quieter kind of peace. Claire came into my life because of a spreadsheet. Of all things. My old roommate, Marcus, had gotten engaged and moved out, and I'd posted a listing out of financial necessity more than desire, expecting to interview a string of strangers and choose the least alarming one. Claire showed up to the viewing in a paint-splattered denim jacket, carrying a duffel bag and a photograph of a golden retriever that had died 3 years earlier, which she showed me unprompted, explaining that she liked to know a place felt like it could hold memories before she decided to live in it. She was blunt in a way that should have unsettled me, and instead disarmed me completely. She asked if I snored. She asked if I was the type of person who left dishes in the sink out of spite. She asked, very seriously, whether I would mind if she sometimes cried in the kitchen at 2 inches the morning, because grief, she said, does not respect a schedule. I found out later that Claire had lost her younger brother, Theo, in a car accident, 18 months before she moved in a boy of 19, who had been driving home from a late shift at a hardware store when a truck ran a red light. She rarely spoke about him directly in those early months. Instead, grief leaked out of her sideways, in the way she flinched at ambulance sirens, in the way she kept his old flannel shirt folded on the top shelf of her closet, in the way she sometimes stood at our kitchen window at odd hours, staring at nothing, her jaw tight, her arms wrapped around herself, like she was trying to hold her own ribs together. We built our friendship slowly, the way 2 wary animals build trust, not through grand gestures but through repetition. She started leaving me a cup of coffee on the counter before she left for her early shifts, black with 1 sugar, because she'd noticed once, in passing, how I took it. I started leaving the porch light on for her on nights she worked late, because I'd noticed she hated walking up to a dark building. We developed rituals without ever naming them as such. Sunday grocery runs where we'd argue affectionately over whether generic cereal was a moral failing. Thursday night reruns of an old sitcom we both pretended to be too sophisticated for. Small check-ins texted across the apartment, even when we were both home, because somehow it felt safer to ask, "You good?" through a screen than out loud. I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the whole point of this channel. I noticed I was falling for her long before that February night. I noticed it in October, when she fell asleep on the couch during a thunderstorm, and I sat beside her for an hour, afraid to move in case I woke her, memorizing the way her eyelashes cast small shadows on her cheeks in the lamplight. I noticed it in December when she came home from her brother's birthday, the first one since his death, and sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets. And I sat down next to her without a word and simply stayed there until she was ready to speak. And when she finally did speak, it wasn't about Theo at all. She just said, "Thank you for not asking me to explain." And something in my chest rearranged itself permanently. I noticed it every single time she laughed at something stupid I said, and looked at me like I'd done something worth remembering. But I said nothing, because I had learned the hard way that wanting someone was dangerous, and that the people you let yourself need are the people with the power to leave you standing at an altar of your own building, holding nothing. Claire, for her part, carried her own quiet armor. I learned over months of careful observation that she had been engaged once too, to a man named Jason, who had convinced her, slowly and methodically, that her grief over Theo was too much, that she cried too often, that she needed to get over it, for the relationship to survive. He left 4 months after the funeral, telling her she'd become someone he didn't recognize, as if sorrow were a personality flaw, rather than the most human thing a person can carry. She told me this once, on a night in January, her voice flat in the particular way people's voices go flat when they've rehearsed a story. So many times it stopped hurting on the surface, even though you can tell it's still bleeding underneath. So there we were, two people who had each been told, in different ways, by different people, that they were too much to love and too broken to keep living together in a small apartment with peeling countertops and a radiator that clanked like a ghost with a grudge, slowly, carefully, without either of us admitting it, becoming each other's safest place. Which brings me back to that February night, to her hands under my shirt, to the moment everything shifted. I didn't move for a long moment. I sat there with her cold palms pressed flat against my stomach, her head tipping sideways to rest against my shoulder, and I stared at the muted documentary on the television, some narrator silently mouthing facts about migrating birds, and I tried to remember how ordinary breathing worked. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. There was something in the way she'd done it, unthinking, instinctive, like her body had simply decided that my warmth was the safest thing in the room, and gone looking for it without asking her permission. That told me more than words could have. "Rough shift," I finally asked, my voice rougher than I intended. "A man yelled at me for 20 minutes because we were out of the soup he wanted," she said into my shoulder. And then on my walk home, I passed the intersection. She didn't have to say which intersection. I knew. It was 3 blocks from the diner, the one with the crumpled guardrail that had never quite been repaired, the one she always found a way to avoid except on nights she was too tired to remember to reroute herself. "I just needed to sit somewhere warm for a minute," she added. "Sorry, I probably should have asked." "You don't have to ask," I said, and I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything in the past 2 years. We sat like that for nearly 20 minutes, her hands slowly warming against my skin, neither of us acknowledging the strange, charged intimacy of it, both of us pretending it was simply what roommates did for each other on cold nights. But something had shifted, and we both knew it. The way you know a storm has passed even before you look outside by the sudden stillness in the air, the way everything feels rearranged. I wish I could tell you that from that night forward, everything was easy, that we confessed our feelings under some perfectly timed street lamp, and lived happily ever after within the week. But real love, the kind that actually survives, is rarely that simple. And if you've lived even a little, you already know that. What followed instead was 6 more weeks of the most exquisite, painful uncertainty I've ever experienced. A slow unraveling of 2 people learning, cautiously, how to want something again. Claire began finding small excuses to be near me. She'd bring her laptop to the living room, instead of working in her room. She'd ask me to watch things with her that she absolutely didn't need company to watch. She started touching my arm when she laughed, a habit she'd never had before, light and quick, like she was testing whether it was allowed. And I found myself doing the same, finding reasons to linger in doorways, memorizing the sound of her footsteps on the stairs, so I'd know it was her before she even reached the door, buying the specific brand of tea she liked without ever telling her I'd noticed she was running low. The moment that nearly broke everything open came in early March, on a night when Claire came home late from what I assumed was another diner shift, but which I later learned was actually dinner with Jason. He'd reached out, apparently, wanting to talk things through, wanting, in his words, closure. She hadn't told me beforehand because, she admitted later, she was afraid of what it would mean if she did, afraid that naming it out loud to me would force her to admit something she wasn't ready to admit, which was that some small, guarded part of her had wanted my reaction, more than she'd wanted his apology. I remember the particular quality of dread I felt when she came home that night, smelling faintly of a restaurant I didn't recognize, her makeup slightly smudged from crying, and my mind went immediately, viciously, to the worst possible conclusion. I asked too sharply where she'd been, and she told me. And I said something I regret to this day, something cold, something about how it wasn't my business anyway, something that put up exactly the kind of wall I'd spent months quietly trying to dismantle in myself. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. I told him no, she said, her voice shaking with something between anger and hurt. He wanted to try again, he said. He'd changed. And I told him no because... She stopped herself, jaw tight, eyes glassy. Because why? I asked, and I hated how desperate I sounded, how transparent. Because I didn't want him, she said, quieter now. I wanted to come home. The word home hung in the air between us, heavier than either of us was prepared for. We stood in that kitchen, under a flickering overhead light, two people who had each buried a version of themselves that believed in being chosen, staring at each other like the ground beneath us had just tilted. Claire, I started, but she shook her head, tears finally spilling over. I don't know how to do this, she said. I don't know how to want someone again without being terrified. They'll leave the second. I'm too much for them. I don't know how to let someone see me fall apart and trust that they won't use it as an exit. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I crossed the kitchen without deciding to, and I pulled her into me, and she didn't resist. She just folded into my chest like she'd been waiting months for permission. I'm not going anywhere, I told her, into her hair, my hands pressed flat against her back the way hers had once been pressed against my stomach on that February night. The two of us finally, fully, honestly touching each other with intention instead of accident. I know what it's like to be told. You're too much, I've been there, and I'm telling you, you were never too much for me. You were the first thing in 2 years that made too much feel like exactly enough. She pulled back just far enough to look at me, her eyes red-rimmed and searching, like she needed to check my face for lies before she let herself believe the words. Whatever she found there must have convinced her because she reached up slowly and pressed her palm against my cheek, warm this time. No longer freezing, no longer an accident of survival, but a deliberate choice, and I turned my face into her hand and closed my eyes and let myself, for the first time in 2 years, believe that I was allowed to be held onto. We didn't kiss that night. It would have felt too fast, too easy, after everything both of us had been carrying. Instead, we sat on the kitchen floor together, backs against the cabinets, the way she once had alone in December. And we really talked, for the first time about Theo, about Elena, about Jason, about every wound we'd both been quietly nursing under the guise of being fine, capable, self-sufficient roommates, who simply happened to leave each other coffee and porch lights. She told me about the last conversation she'd had with her brother, a stupid argument about whose turn it was to do the dishes, and how she'd give anything to have that argument back instead of the silence that replaced it. I told her about standing at the altar rehearsal 3 weeks before my wedding was supposed to happen, not yet knowing it never would, feeling for one strange, fleeting moment, like something was wrong, and dismissing the feeling because I didn't want to believe my own instincts could be right about something so devastating. By the time the sky outside our kitchen window began turning that pale, uncertain blue that comes just before dawn, we weren't the same two people who had walked into that kitchen the night before. We were two people who had, brick by brick, dismantled the walls we'd built to keep ourselves safe, and discovered, underneath all that rubble, that safety had never actually required those walls at all. It had only ever required the right person on the other side of them. Spring came slowly that year, the way it always does in a city that doesn't quite believe winter is over, until it's forced to. Claire and I moved into something neither of us rushed to name, because naming it felt almost unnecessary. We already knew what we were to each other, in the way you know the shape of a room in the dark, by feel rather than sight. She started leaving her hand in mine during our Sunday grocery runs. I started walking her home from her late shifts instead of just leaving the porch light on, because I'd realized that light from a window can only do so much, and some nights a person needs an actual hand to hold on the walk past a crumpled guardrail. I remember the night I finally kissed her, really kissed her, not the accidental, electric almost moments we'd been circling for weeks, with a clarity that still makes my chest ache in the good way. It was late April, unseasonably warm, and we were sitting on the fire escape outside her bedroom window, a habit we'd started because she said Theo used to love sitting on rooftops. And something about being up high, closer to the sky, made her feel like she was sharing the view with him. We'd been talking about nothing in particular, a mispronounced word, a memory from her childhood, the ridiculous argument we'd had that week about whether pineapple belonged on pizza when she went quiet mid-sentence. And just looked at me, really looked, the city lights catching gold in her eyes, and she said, "I think I've been in love with you since you let me put my freezing hands on your stomach," and didn't even flinch. I flinched internally, I told her, extensively. She laughed that real laugh, the one that made her nose scrunch, the one I'd been quietly collecting evidence of for months, and I reached over and tucked a piece of hair behind her ear, and then I kissed her softly, carefully, like she was something I'd been given permission to want. After 2 long years of believing wanting things was dangerous, she kissed me back like she'd been waiting for exactly this, on exactly this fire escape, under exactly this sky, and somewhere below us the city kept moving, indifferent and beautiful, while 2 people who had each been told they were too broken to be loved sat wrapped in each other, proving that story wrong. If this story is stirring something in you right now, if you've ever needed someone to simply stay instead of leave, if you've ever found warmth in the last place you expected it, I want you to take a moment before the story finishes and let this channel know it reached you. Like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need this story tonight. These small acts tell me that stories about ordinary kindness still matter, still land, still change something in the people who watch them. And honestly, that keeps this channel alive. We didn't tell people right away. Claire's mother, a woman still carrying her own grief for Theo like a stone in her coat pocket, worried aloud that Claire was moving too fast. That grief made people cling to whoever was nearest, that she should be careful not to mistake comfort for love. Claire cried after that phone call, not because she doubted us, but because she was so tired of everyone treating her healing as suspicious, as though a person who has survived something unbearable isn't allowed to also, eventually, find something good. I held her that night the way I'd held her in the kitchen months before, and I told her the only thing I knew for certain, that comfort and love aren't opposites competing for the same space in a person's heart. Sometimes comfort is exactly how love first learns to speak, quietly, in a language safer than words, in cold hands finding warmth, in porch lights left on, in someone choosing, again and again, small ordinary day by small ordinary day, to stay. By June, Claire had unpacked Theo's flannel shirt from the top shelf of her closet, not to put it away, but to wear it sometimes on cool mornings, folding the 2 long sleeves up over her wrists. And I understood, without her explaining, that this was a different kind of holding on than before, not a shirt kept frozen in grief, untouched, a shrine to a version of pain that couldn't move forward, but a shirt worn into a new life, carried along rather than left behind. She told me once, wearing it while we cooked dinner together, that she thought Theo would have liked me, that he'd have teased me mercilessly about my taste in documentaries, and then probably asked me, very seriously, whether my intentions toward his sister were honorable. I told her I hoped, wherever he was, he already knew the answer. I want to tell you about one more night, because I think it's the night that made me understand what this whole story had actually been about. It was late July, almost a year to the day since Claire had first walked into our apartment, carrying a duffel bag and a photograph of a dog who'd been gone 3 years, and we were lying on the living room floor, because the air conditioning had broken, and the floor was the coolest surface in the apartment. And Claire turned to me in the dark and asked, quietly, "Do you ever think about how close we came to never actually saying anything? Like, we could have just stayed roommates, polite, careful, Forever. I thought about it, really thought about it. About all the nights I'd swallowed what I felt because I was so certain that wanting her would end in the same silence Elena had left behind. About all the nights. Claire told me later she'd stood outside my bedroom door, hand raised to knock, only to lower it and walk away, convinced that needing someone again would somehow dishonor everything she'd survived. I think, I said finally, that some people are worth the risk of finding out, even when every part of you has been taught to expect the worst. I turned my head toward her in the dark. I think your hands got cold on purpose that night. Some deeper, smarter part of you already knew what it needed, even if the rest of you was too scared to ask for it directly. She laughed softly, but her eyes were wet. Maybe, she whispered. Or maybe I was just really, genuinely freezing, and you happened to be warm, and everything after that was just too lucky. Scared people finally getting brave at the same time. Maybe both things were true. Maybe that's how most real love actually starts, not with some grand cinematic declaration, but with something small and human and almost accidental, cold hands finding warmth. A porch light left on out of habit, a person choosing, quietly, again and again, to stay in the room instead of walking away from it. Maybe the bravest thing either of us ever did wasn't some dramatic leap of faith, but simply allowing ourselves slowly, one Tuesday night at a time, to be held by someone after we'd both been so sure holding wasn't safe anymore. Claire and I still live in that same apartment. The radiator still groans like a dying thing every winter, and some nights, when she comes home from a long shift with her hands like ice, she still slides them under my shirt without asking, and I still forget how to breathe for exactly 3 seconds every single time, because I don't think I'll ever get used to being someone's safe place. And I hope I never do. I hope it stays exactly this astonishing, this small, quiet miracle of being chosen by someone who once believed she was too much to keep, by someone who once believed he wasn't enough to stay for. Before I let you go, I want to ask something small of you. If this story found its way into your chest tonight, if it reminded you of your own cold hands, once finding warmth somewhere you didn't expect, or if it simply made you believe, even a little, that second chances are real, I want you to comment the word warmth below. Just that one word. I read every single one, and I promise you, they matter more than you know. They remind me that these stories are reaching real people, carrying real weight, doing exactly what I hope they do. Claire and I got married the following spring, in a small backyard ceremony with string lights strung between 2 crooked trees. And when it came time for vows, I didn't talk about fireworks or lightning bolts or any of the dramatic language people use to describe falling in love. I talked about warmth. I talked about a Tuesday night in February, about cold hands and a couch, and a documentary about migrating birds neither of us was really watching. I talked about how love, real love, the kind that survives grief and broken engagements, and every wall 2 frightened people can build, doesn't usually arrive like a storm. It arrives like heat slowly returning to numb fingers, quiet, gradual, undeniable, and then suddenly, achingly, everything. If you've made it this far with us, thank you for staying. Thank you for believing, even for these few minutes, in the quiet magic of 2 ordinary, wounded people finding their way back to warmth in each other. If this story touched you even a fraction as much as it meant to write, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Corner, and share it with someone who might need a reminder tonight that it's not too late to be chosen, that it's not too late to choose someone back, and that sometimes the smallest gesture's a porch light, a cup of coffee. 2 cold hands finding warmth in the dark are the ones that end up changing everything, because in the end, that's all love really ever asks of us, to notice when someone is freezing, and to let them